The 2025 release of Metroid Prime 4 draws closer every day after nearly a decade of waiting. In early 2023, Nintendo released the incredible Metroid Prime Remastered to help gamers through this difficult time. Ever since then, a slow burn of rumors and speculation has left gamers wondering if we'll ever see a similar treatment for Prime 2 and 3. The stunning, complex worlds of Prime 2 could truly come to life on the more powerful Switch hardware, and the ambitious vision of Prime 3 could be better realized. Unfortunately, at this point, a full graphical overhaul of either of those games might be unlikely, which we'll discuss more in a moment, but there's still hope on the horizon. You see, Nintendo technically already ported Prime 2 and 3 to another system in the past, and it's very possible history will repeat itself for the Switch. That's right, I'm talking about the Metroid Prime Trilogy, which is sort of its own unusual entity in the Metroid universe. So in this video, we'll discuss why porting the entire trilogy as a unit might make more sense than solo releases, the unique problems and opportunities that creates, the minimum set of features that port should include, and what realistic tweaks could make it something really special. Please consider subscribing to support the growing channel for more retro and gaming analysis content. Your support really means a lot. Alright, so I think it's a bit odd that people keep discussing ports of Prime 2 and 3 as sort of standalone entities, when in reality, it's probably more likely we'll just receive a port of the Metroid Prime Trilogy. The Prime Trilogy was originally released for the Wii in 2009. It repackaged all three Metroid Prime games from the GameCube era into a single disc, in a shiny metal case if you were lucky to get the collector's edition. This package also retrofitted the motion controls of Prime 3 onto the first two games. In fact, motion controls were the only option for this package, more on that in a moment. The Prime Trilogy also added widescreen support, a unified menu system to pick which game you wanted to play, and a pseudo-trophy system to unlock art galleries. Overall, it was a pretty awesome package at the time, despite a couple issues we'll discuss later. The Trilogy Collection was later ported to the Wii U eShop essentially unchanged as a digital release. Unfortunately, this digital port happened later in the Wii U's very short life cycle when the system was already fading. Very few people bought a Wii U in the first place, so this ended up a very niche release. However, Nintendo could simply repeat this process, enhance the port a bit, and hopefully find greater success on the wildly popular Switch and Switch 2. The Switch has a massive install base, Metroid is currently a bit more popular than usual, and Nintendo really wants Metroid Prime 4 to succeed, so it makes sense for them to get the timing right and put a bit of effort into making this re-release shine. There are many reasons this approach of just updating and porting the trilogy version makes sense. I would absolutely love to see more significant remasters of both games. I have deep dive videos about what this might look like for both Prime 2 and 3 on my channel, but at this point, I'm not sure that's realistic. Nintendo is insanely busy with R&D for the Switch 2, as evidenced by the recent report that they've spent over $1 billion on it, a staggering amount of money for a company of their size. Retro Studios is also very busy trying to get Prime 4 out in 2025. They've still recently been hiring for various roles on this game, so I'm guessing there's a good amount of work left, and the game could still be over a year out. Retro Studios handled the original Prime Remastered supposedly as sort of an engine upgrade test and team preparation for Prime 4, so I don't think they have the resources available anymore to also overhaul 2 and 3 anytime soon, which are also much more ambitious games in terms of size and scope. Because Metroid Prime Remastered runs on an updated version of the original engine, theoretically that means the Prime Trilogy should also be able to run on Switch, with some modest updates of course. Therefore, it might make more sense to either take a small subset of the Retro team and handle a more limited scale port of the original Trilogy package, or hand that project off to a separate supervised studio who probably wouldn't have the expertise or resources to handle a huge overhaul to match what Retro did for the first game. Plus, the Trilogy already runs in widescreen with a revamped menu system and unified presentation, meaning it's most of the way there, except for one major issue. Remember, in its original state, the Metroid Prime Trilogy is entirely based on motion controls. Prime 1 and 2 were retrofitted to support the motion controls, and Prime 3 always had them exclusively. Now, the Switch could theoretically handle this setup thanks to the motion or gyro capabilities of the Switch Joy-Cons. In fact, Retro already completed that type of conversion work with Metroid Prime Remastered. I'm guessing it would actually be less work to adopt Joy-Con motion control support for Prime 1 and 2 to make this package work than to try and remove all of the motion interactions from Prime 3. I think Prime 3 is actually a major barrier to getting these ports on Switch, but going the Trilogy route and keeping the motion controls intact, at least for Prime 3, could be a huge help. I really want to stress that I'm only encouraging motion controls as a default fallback option just to get the Trilogy on Switch. I certainly think dual analog controls should be added. We'll come back to that. However, gamers were so happy that dual analog control was finally added to Prime Remastered that many either never tried or forgot about the included motion controls. I've found that if you give them a chance, the motion controls in the remaster can be as good or better than the Wii, though the default calibration settings are not great, and obviously dual analog is still my ideal choice by far. So if we look at these motion controls in Prime Remastered, the customization options are actually pretty impressive. You can calibrate the aiming sensitivity, which is how fast your cursor moves around the screen in front of you. But you can also calibrate the turning sensitivity, or how fast Samus turns once your aiming cursor moves towards the edges of the screen. I've found that if you slightly bump up the aiming speed, and then more significantly bump up the turning speed, it gives kind of a quick aiming experience that nicely eases into turning with similar momentum. In fact, you can actually turn around much quicker in Prime Remastered using motion controls than you ever could in the Wii version. The Wii was notoriously slow for turning around, though this wasn't usually a huge issue since the Prime games are relatively slow and forward moving. The Switch motion controls do have some notable quirks though, the worst of which is that the cursor tends to drift or lose its centering, so you have to occasionally tap the right shoulder trigger to reorient the cursor to the center. The calibration also tends to freak out a bit if you set the Joy-Con down at a weird angle for a moment, and then pick it up again during gameplay. Hopefully these types of issues could be improved with a second attempt, but part of this is just the nature of motion controls, which is why I usually don't like them. The Switch motion controls also have an advantage of dual analog sticks via the Joy-Cons, while the Wii only had one joystick on the nunchuck. This means that your visor selection is mapped to the D-pad on the left Joy-Con, and your beam selection is set to the right Joy-Con stick, which ends up creating a sort of interesting hybrid of the GameCube controls and Wii controls. Anyway, the important point here is that the Switch hardware could theoretically support the existing Prime Trilogy control scheme. Again, this is especially good news for Prime 3, which has motion controls all over the place, and I think trying to update all of those spots to use dual analog controls would be very difficult. I'm not sure how technically complex or how much work it is to map the Wii controls to the Joy-Cons, obviously, but hopefully this would be a simple path forward that could reuse some or all of Retro's existing work. Ignoring the Prime Trilogy and sticking to individual releases would also cause some other issues as well. If Nintendo just ported Prime 2 and 3 over, that means we sadly might lose the original version of Prime 1 forever, unless they also chose to port that individually, but that seems less likely given the focus on the remaster. I would love to have the original version, or at least something closer to it, preserved on Switch along with the other two. Also, if Nintendo decided to port the games individually, it would potentially require other graphical updates. For example, Prime 2 has my favorite main menu in all of gaming, but it was tragically never updated beyond the GameCube release, since all three games lost their original menus for the port to the Trilogy version. The original menus in these games used some pre-rendered visuals or assets, which might be part of why they were abandoned in the widescreen Prime Trilogy, so Nintendo would have to recreate those visuals in widescreen to support that. I think there's also some value in just giving newcomers the entire trilogy at once at a reasonable price, so they don't necessarily have to invest in the remaster and then two other games individually, although Nintendo isn't exactly known for their generous value with ports. Now, porting the entire trilogy package over also allows for plenty of realistic opportunities for improvement. Obviously, the number one change would have to be adding dual analog support for at least Prime 1 and 2, which were designed without motion controls in mind in the first place, so this creates a pretty natural mapping. I'd also love to see the original GameCube controls included, which feel unique to this day. All these changes would be difficult for Prime 3, as I mentioned earlier, but Nintendo could always require motion controls specifically for Prime 3. I think that's somewhat reasonable given how integral they are to the experience. Now there is an Achilles heel here known as the Switch Lite, which would not be a great experience for Prime 3, and really Prime 3 probably wouldn't work well in handheld mode in general. I'm not sure what to do about that one. I've never really been a fan of the Switch Lite personally anyways. Moving on. Now increasing the game resolution to 1080p is also obviously a must, even if no other graphical changes are made. Some minor texture cleanup would be ideal. I think even minor improvements would go a long way to enhance these beautiful games. If I could choose one small but unlikely enhancement to make, it would be to restore the original menus of the three games. I know I just ranted earlier about how this would add work, but I think it would be so cool to see these return regardless of the port format. You could even keep the existing Unified Trilogy menu system intact to select your game initially. For example, instead of loading to this Me selection screen, which really isn't even relevant anymore on the Switch, you could instead load to one screen down where you select which game you want to play. After selecting that, it starts up the original game's menu sequence, and your save files could just be tied to your Switch profile like so many other games do. I think these menus actually go a long way to establish the mood for each game and are just really cool. I was so glad when they recreated this for Prime 1. So I'm really curious to hear what all of your thoughts are on this. What is the ideal port setup for Prime 2 and 3 in your view? Would you prefer standalone releases, or would you rather see the entire trilogy brought over with a couple different control options? Which updates, however minor or major, do you think are essential or your most wanted? Leave a comment and let's discuss.